Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. We're back again with our day two opening keynote by Shivangi Nadkarni. Whatever I say is less for her. She's been an inspiration for many of us here in India. She is the founder of Arca and now she has joined hands with Persistent. There's so much to talk about her, and especially the topic she has is digital governance. There is so many things to learn in this area. So, without further ado, I'm going to give it to her so that we can get to know about her experience in cybersecurity and her work in privacy area, and especially about the talk, which is about digital governance. Ma'am, the stage is all yours.
Hi, Vandana. Thank you so much for inviting me. Such a pleasure to be here. So I actually began my career in cybersecurity since this is the OS community. Way back before I think some of you were even born. Back in 99, 2000, when the Indian IT Act was just passed, and I was working with SIFI, where we tied up with VeriSign to set up the first certifying authority in India, digital signatures, and so on. And that's where I got introduced to the area of cryptography and digital signatures and so on, and that's how I got into this space. And then I continued working in that area till I, worked with another large IT services company, and then I kind of founded Arca with my co-founder. And now it's been almost a decade that we've been implementing privacy, pretty complicated programs that we've been involved in. A lot of learning happens when we do that. So that's really where along the way, we've built India's first privacy management platform, which is targeted towards MSMEs. We run a privacy testing lab. So privacy testing is very different from security testing that you are very intimately familiar with. You kind of don't look for vulnerabilities. You look for where data is being shared, high risk permissions, legitimate SDKs embedded in apps, and so on. We run, of course, we do training and so on. So that's really where we are. And as I speak, we are in the process of being acquired by Persistent Systems, where we are going to go in and set up their overall digital governance practice. So that's in short.
Congratulations, ma'am. That's amazing.
Thank you.
So, ma'am, when it comes to data privacy and digital governance, I think we can get started with the presentation, and we have a lot of questions and so many things. I'm sure if there's anything left, we can ask in the end. But I'm so looking forward to this presentation.
Definitely. When you asked me to speak and address this very august gathering, I asked you, what am I going to add value here, right? Because you guys are very intimately familiar with all the aspects of cybersecurity and what is involved in it. So, which is why I said, let me speak a little bit, zoom out and speak, overall about digital governance and how it is being defined worldwide, and how it looks at all kinds of risks. So there is a world beyond cybersecurity that the world is grappling with, right? So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll do a deep dive into data privacy. Yeah? So I think this is something all of us know, but just so that we are on the same page, essentially wherever you have people, wherever you have organizations, and wherever you have devices, and devices, I'm not just talking about our laptops, mobile phones, etc., but I'm also talking about smart devices, smart cities, all of those. Wherever you have that, you essentially have data, right? And where there's data, there are risks, and we all know that very well, right? So there's data and its processing and its underlying infrastructure, and the people who are involved in all of that give rise to a whole bunch of inherent risks that I don't need to explain to this community, right? They know that very well. Further, data flows without any boundaries today, right? But laws are geography or country specific, right? So that creates another dimension of risk. Okay. Add to that, you have geopolitics, and you have cultures and attitudes of people which vary across the world. So that creates a whole new, realm of risk. So we've seen how overnight certain apps are banned by the government. We've seen that in India, right? Over a period of time. And similarly, things happen around the world. So, which completely again brings in a whole different bunch of risks which are associated with data, right? And then the way we have, like, for example, Europe is very, very conscious, an average European is very conscious about privacy. But if you see outside, like in Asian countries where we come from a very different social fabric, our attitude towards privacy is very different. But privacy as a culture, and the moment people realize what's going on with their data, it assumes a very different flavor, right? So basically, a whole new set of risks around it, right? Now, into this mix, you add the reality of today, which is one extremely rapid pace of technology innovation, as well as the rapid pace of proliferation, right? It doesn't take long for technology to proliferate. A very deep penetration of technology and data infrastructure into mass populations, right? Today, everybody roams around with a smartphone. It wasn't so a few years ago, right? Like, let's say in a country like India, you have the entire digital stack around which you have things like UPI payment systems, you have Aadhaar, you have a whole bunch of other things which just in turn each of that spews forth data, right? Um, then then you have the reality of what I call total global domination of the data rich businesses too, right? I mean, you have big tech, you have others who are completely dominate certain aspects of businesses worldwide, and therefore penetrate into the overall business scenario, right? uh, this reality further exacerbates the nature and complexity of risk, right? Now, therefore, to manage all these risks, you have various streams and domains of digital risk and trust and governance that have emerged and are emerging even as we speak, right? One stream we are all intimately familiar with, that is of cybersecurity, but there are others as well. Um, I have showcased here a diagram that was recently released by IPP in their digital governance report, which kind of puts together all the various domains that are a part of digital governance. And I thought it's a good way of showcasing how the world looks at this and where it is headed, right? So, right on top, you have cybersecurity. Cybersecurity has, as a domain, has matured over the years, has become extremely complex, and all of you are battling with the realities of it. So, it continues to be extremely large, but as a domain, it has matured quite a bit, right? Then you have the new baby on the block or new kid on the block, which is AI governance, right? Given the proliferation and explosion of AI in the last few years, the governance and managing of risks around AI has become very, very imperative and urgent. And therefore, there are different ways in which AI risks are managed. The EU has even passed an EU AI Act. Some states in the US have passed a AI Act. Then there are other ways of governing. You know, people tend to think that governance is only around laws and regulations, but there are standards, there are best practices, there are guidances issued by different governments. For example, in Asia alone, the Singapore government has something, the Chinese government has something, Japan has done some work, Australia has done work, Korea has done work. All of them may not have passed laws, but they have very clear guidances and practices in place, because this space is evolving and everybody's trying to figure out the best way to manage the risks which are coming out as a result of AI adoption, and it is being done, as we speak, right? So you can use that proverbial analogy that everybody gives, which is that when it comes to AI governance and risks, it is like, you're building the airplane on the runway kind of scenario, right? Um, you also have privacy and data protection, which is a completely different area from cybersecurity, and we're going to get a little bit into that in detail, because it solves for a completely different set of risks, right? So, cybersecurity solves for the risks of CIA, which we are all intimately familiar with. AI governance solves for risks emerging from AI. Privacy solves for another different set of risks, and so on. Then you have the overall online safety domain, right? How do individuals remain safe when they are online? There are predators. There is children online, and a whole different way of looking at protecting children online, and so on. Then there is the whole area of competition and antitrust, for example, because you have organizations who dominate the digital space, creating concerns around lack of competition. Therefore, you will, I'm sure all of us have seen the various cases going on, as well as some of the activities, some of the judgments that courts have passed in terms of certain large big tech organizations enjoying certain monopoly, and therefore antitrust regulations coming in. Even in India, there's a digital competition law that is in the making, and that has a completely different implication when it comes to organizations and the way organizations manage risks, right? Then there is e-commerce, again a huge area, not just in India but globally, and the risks associated with e-commerce. For example, one of the risks that is talked about is that of dark patterns. And even what is a dark pattern? I'm sure all of us are familiar. When you're shopping, for example, it tells you that just so many minutes left for this deal to close, or it just says just two last two units in stock. May not be, maybe may not be the truth. It forces us to take certain actions, right? Or there are other ways in which you are, as an individual, guided into, or subtly nudged into certain decisions that you end up taking while you're shopping, while you're doing other things online. So these are known as dark patterns, and there are actually guidelines available for two organizations to not adopt dark patterns. So, for example, the Consumer Affairs Ministry in India has issued very stringent guidelines for dark patterns in India, which organizations are expected to follow. So, this is one example of the kind of risks in the digital sphere associated with e-commerce, right? Similarly, accessibility. No, people globally, not everybody has the same level of access to the online world, to the digital world. How do therefore individuals and countries manage their populations given the limited types of accessibilities that may be available? Okay. Intellectual property. I mean, there's a huge debate today going on around, for example, the data being used by AI training models. For training AI models, the data, and whether there is impingement on intellectual property, how does that get managed? Again, lots of debate, lots of questions. Answers are still coming, right? So that's an area of big risks considered by organizations. And then, of course, all of this comes into the uh, realm of national security, law enforcement, because things are happening online. So how do you ensure national security in a scenario like this? How does law enforcement come in when there are crimes and frauds and etc. happening online? And then the whole issue of product liability. Those of you who have looked a little bit at the EUAI Act, there is talk of products and product liability today. And when we say products, it is not just apps. So apps are considered products, but look at physical products today. Most products that we have some angle of data and automation around it, right? From even, it doesn't have to be a smart device, right? It could be a non-smart device that has electronic components embedded in it. Look around your house and see the kind of appliances that you need, right? So there are liabilities associated with it, which are not just limited to the physical space, but there are liabilities that come into the digital domain as well. So, this is to give you a sense of the kind of risks beyond cybersecurity that the world and there is grappling with, and therefore is figuring out how to govern these risks. Okay, and how they get managed within an organization setting depends on, a lot of it just depends on the context of the organization. First of all, within that context, the organization has people, processes, data, technology, and then at the core, and then you have customers and partners because they are embedded into your ecosystem. Then there is the overall industry and competitors, some of which again have to work together, right, on many aspects which are pan industry. And then you have the overall macro environment, right from the legal, economic, technological, environmental becoming critical. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the challenges around ESG. And then you have, of course, the political scenario and the social setup, social fabric, right? So, or managing of these risks are not a standalone kind of thing. It cannot be done in isolation. It has to be done within this framework, right? So it adds to that level of complexity. So the good news, of course, is that most areas have standardized frameworks, standards, methodologies, approaches, processes, principles to address some of these challenges at an organizational level. Many are being built, right? So some are available, some are being developed. There's a lot of work going on in almost every area that we just discussed. Okay, and many of these are aligned to, or they are reflected in associated laws, regulations, and acts. So for example, if you look at the area of AI, if you look at the area of data privacy, which we'll be talking about shortly, many of them at the core have certain principles, and a lot of those principles get embedded into laws and regulations, and therefore it becomes provides some kind of standardization, and it becomes in principle based rather than something which is a detailed prescriptive kind of activity, right? So um, so that is uh, so this is to, so what I talked about till now is looking at the zoomed out approach and looking at digital governance overall, and just giving you a sense and a flavor of what is going on around the world. It's a very exciting time to be in this space because there's just so many problems that are being attempted to be solved, right? And they're all interconnected, they're not in isolation, right? So all of us have a role to play, no matter which corner of the world we are in and which corner of this sort of landscape that we are trying to solve and help solve. It is intricately connected to everything else. So no matter how deep and where in your specialization is, you have to from time to time raise your head, look around you, and see, take a deep breath and see or kya kya ho raha hai, so that you're in a position to uh, add all of that into the depth of what you are working on, right? Now let's move on to doing a deep dive into one area, which is data privacy, right? So a lot of times people are, there is, despite so many years in this field, I still come across people who are extremely confused about what, at the essence, what is data privacy. Okay, so first of all, data privacy applies only to personal data. And why is this important? Because organizations deal with a lot of critical data that is not personal data, right? So, financials of an organization, the inventory levels of an of manufacturing setup, for example. Now, a lot of this is very, very confidential, highly sensitive data, but it is not personal data, right? So, when you look at it from as a security person, you are tasked with managing the security of all data in an organization, whether it's personal, whether it's non-personal, right? But when you wear your privacy lens, remember you're focused only on personal data, and privacy per se is not applicable to non-personal data. Okay, so that's the first thing. That brings us to the next question: is therefore what is personal data, right? So personal data, no matter which law you look at, is essentially defined as any information or data element that relates to an individual and can directly identify an individual, right? And that's what we all intuitively think of when we talk about what is personal data, right? So intuitively, we all know name, mail address, bank account details, employee IDs, right? All of these are details that can directly identify an individual, and that's what we think of when someone says personal data. However, the definition of personal data also extends to what is called potentially identifying individual, right? Meaning that that particular data element, when combined with other data elements, and those that combination can happen now at this point in time, or it can happen anytime later. So there is a potential to combine it with other data elements which your organization may not even have access to, right? Some third party can take this data element and combine it with some other data element. So as long as the potential is there, which can lead to the eventual identification of an individual, is considered personal data. So, for example, IP addresses, cookie identifiers, GPS location, time at location, repeated online behaviors, a whole world by itself, right? Behavioral analysis and so on. All of that is also personal, right? So, therefore, examples, right? So, we long ago at Arca, we came up with this rather simplistic, depiction, and we found that this works. Okay, so there is data what we call above the surface that we all kind of intuitively relate to. So there is identity data, data like your name, address, Aadhaar, PAN number, passport details, etc. There is financial data like bank account details, your insurance data, your PF data, for example, and so on. Health and biometric, fingerprints, medical records, whatnot, and even beliefs, right? Religious beliefs, political beliefs. All of this is what is above the surface, and then there is the whole world below the surface, which is things like data that comes out of mobile phone app permissions, for example, right? Location, contact, camera, all kinds of things. Then you have data that comes via cookies and trackers on websites, right? You have data that comes out of sensors, RFID tags, smart data that comes out of smart devices like smart TV, smart health devices, etc. Then there's also the data that is derived or inferred via analytics within an organization. There's data, for example, that comes from smart vehicles. And in fact, I go a step further and I say it's not just smart vehicles, any vehicles which have software embedded in it, which is sending data to a central server, is basically personal data, right? Okay, so now that we are clear about what is personal data, let's try and understand, therefore, what is data privacy, right? So, as an individual, let's say I deal with a bank. Okay, please note I am using the example of a bank. I am not using social media as an example. Okay, I'm dealing with a bank, I'm dealing with a insurance company. In return, as an individual, I have certain expectations, okay, around my personal data. What are those expectations? Those are actually the core of privacy. Okay, so pd is personal data. What is my personal data being used for? Is the personal data being collected more than what is required by your organization to offer me the product or service that I'm availing from you? Are you sharing it with a third party without my knowledge? Are you going to allow me to access it and make corrections? Are you taking my consent for all that you're doing with my personal data? Right? And is my personal data being properly secured? The last window I've deliberately colored it differently because that is something that all of us are, as cybersecurity professionals, are intimately familiar with, right? Protecting, securing personal data. But oftentimes people loosely use interchangeably use the term data privacy and data security, uh, not realizing that data security is an important core aspect, but it is not all of privacy. Privacy is all of this and much more. Okay? So let's look at now. All of these are what are called, there are standard terminologies over here. We've not, not gone into the details of it, but these are essentially what are termed as privacy principles, and these are what get embedded into any law or regulation around privacy. Incidentally, almost 140 countries around the world have a privacy law. The US is not one of them, but the US has state laws. Okay, about more than 17 states in the US have privacy laws. In addition to this, there are other laws that have privacy principles embedded in it. Other laws or regulations. So, a lot of healthcare laws or regulations, a lot of regulations around financial, services, financial products have privacy, for example, embedded in it. Okay. So, therefore, let's look at India's privacy law, which is the Digital Personal Data Protection Act or the DPDPA. Okay. So, the DPDPA is essentially applicable to any digital personal data that is processed in India, or it is processed outside India but in connection with any activity to do with individuals in India, right? Who are known as data principals. So it can be with relation to offering any kinds of goods and services. This is what in the legal terminology is called extra terrestrial jurisdiction. By the way, this is common across all laws. If you see the GDPR, it says the same thing. You're sitting in India, you're processing data of people in Europe, GDPR is applicable to you. Similarly, you're sitting in Europe, you're processing data of in Europe of individuals sitting in India, the DPDPA is applicable to you. Okay. The what is digital personal data? And there have been a lot of questions about why India has pulled out digital personal data. Okay, essentially, digital personal data is data that is in the digital form. It may have been natively collected digitally or it may have been generated digitally. It doesn't matter. It also includes data that is originally non digital form but has been digitized subsequently, right? Classic examples of financial services, telecom, where you fill in a form, right? And that form then gets scanned. The moment it gets scanned, it becomes digital and it comes under the purview of this act. Okay. Essentially, it says that there is very little data that remains uniquely only in the physical form, and that doesn't come under the purview of that. Okay. Uh, it's important to note that DPDPA applies across the entire data life cycle, right? Processing per se. So it covers everything from collection. Collection of data is also defined as part of processing. Okay, so everything from collection to storage to usage internally, to sharing, sharing with third parties, transferring to third parties, and to destroying ultimately, right? So the DPDPA applies to the entire, life cycle of processing. Data usage includes, for example, structuring, altering, combining, adapting, recording, indexing, retrieval. All of that is considered usage of data. Who are the actors in the DPDPA ecosystem? At the heart of this ecosystem is the individual, people like you and me, who we are the data principals. This entire act basically exists for our data and our data's protection, right? So the law refers to the individual as the data principal or the DP. Worldwide, the terminology used for this is the data subject. Okay. Now, the data principles data may be collected, is essentially processed by the data fiduciary. A data fiduciary is the organization that decides whom they want to, why they want to collect any piece of data, and how it is going to be processed. Okay, they may not do it themselves. So this entity is known as the data fiduciary. In worldwide, the terminology used is data controller. Okay. Now, the data fiduciary may directly interact with the data principal and collect data, or they may employ a third party, a processor, who may collect data on behalf of the data principal. When we've all seen it in our everyday lives, you have sales representatives, you have direct people who come and, let's say, sell you a insurance policy and so on. So there are different data processors, right? And they in turn forward the data to the data fiduciary. The data fiduciary may also have another type of data processor where they just outsource some sort of processing. They don't directly interact with the data principal, right? But how do you differentiate between data processors and the data fiduciary? At the crux of it is a data fiduciary determines the why and the how. Okay, and it's important that you understand this. That's why I'm spending 2 minutes talking about this. The entity that decides why, which is the purpose, the purposes for which you're collecting data, is determined by the entity, and the how, which is the means that it will be processed in. Okay, so we've understood these three actors in the system. Now, certain types of data fiduciaries are classified as significant data fiduciaries. Essentially, a significant data fiduciary, or a SDF, are certain types of entities where the kind of processing that they do is deemed to be considered highly risky. It may be risky because of the sheer volume of data processed. It may be risky because of the kind of data that is being processed, for example, healthcare, biometrics, etc. It may be risky because of the kind of processing that is being done, right? So there may be entities which are small, but the kind of processing that they do, for example, let's say doing behavioral profiling of individuals in some way, or tracking individuals in some way. Okay, they may also come under a high risk kind of entity, and therefore these are subsets of data fiduciaries. And why are they a separate subset? Because there are a set of activities or controls that SDFs need to implement. Okay, so SDFs in turn need to have a data protection officer, who's an individual appointed within the organization. And then they also need to appoint a data auditor, who is somebody who evaluates if the SDF is compliant with the law or not. Okay? And to oversee all this, you have the Data Protection Board of India, which is currently being set up. And then you have, of course, the central government that has the ability to make rules and change the act and so on. So, looking at this from an organization's perspective, right? What does the organization need to pay attention to? So, you have, okay, at the crux of privacy is what I call defining purpose. Okay, so have a very clear purpose or sets of purposes for for the kind of processing that your organization does. You know, answer the why question. Why are you collecting the data? How are you going to use it? Why does this kind of processing need to be done? So on and so forth. Right now, once you have identified the various purposes, make sure you get the data principles consent for each purpose. Okay, and before there are other what I call legal basis, and we'll quickly talk about it later, on which you can process data, but consent is the primary vehicle, so to say. Okay, now before you get consent, you're supposed to provide a notice, which is what we all commonly see as the privacy policy on websites, for example, right? So provide a notice which clearly says what all is being done with that individual's data. Okay, then internally you make sure you limit usage only to these purposes and nothing beyond. It is a very hard problem to solve for at an organization level. Okay, so that and then so obviously once you have the purpose, make sure you collect only what is needed for these purposes and nothing more. Again, a very hard problem to solve, because till date organizations have been working on the premise that they can collect as much data as possible, as long as, of course, the CISO and the CISO's organization is protecting, right? But now has come in an era which says collect only what you need and nothing beyond. And then once the purpose is served, you delete that data. Okay, or either at the once that data is once the purpose is served, or when the individual has withdrawn consent as well. Okay, uh, however, other laws will come in to determine, you need to store data. Like, for example, banking laws require banking certain types of banking data to be stored for X number of years. Income tax laws require certain data storage, so on and so forth. So all of those laws come in and they take precedence over this. So you have to retain data as per those laws. But otherwise, all other data, please delete. Okay. Then you implement security safeguards to prevent any kind of personal data breaches. So, and if the data is breached, you have to report it to the the data protection board, as well as the data principal whose data has been affected. Okay. You are also required to set up an effective grievance redressal mechanism for individuals so that they can come to you with grievances. As I said, as SDFs, there are additional measures. You need to appoint a data protection officer, we just talked about. You need to carry out data audits. It's a new concept, and the world, rules around this are still being framed. And then there's a requirement to conduct impact assessments from time to time, audits, and then there may be other measures that are that would be defined under the act. We briefly talked about how there can be uh, other options besides consent can be used. These are called legal grounds, okay, in the terminology of privacy. So you can, for example, consent is there. There is employment purposes under the Indian DPDPA. So, for example, any kind of data collection processing that's happening for employment purposes, you don't have to go out and get consent, for example. Okay. Then there are certain, there's voluntary submission where some kind of, the individual makes voluntary, submission of voluntary provision of their data. Let's say, for example, giving you an address to ship some goods to, right? And then you have what I call the non BAU activities, like there's a legal obligation, right? So let's say, for example, certain type of data needs to be reported by a bank under the Anti Money Laundering Act, for example. Okay, that's a legal obligation that the bank has to carry out. They can do it. The bank can do it without taking the individual's consent. Okay, or they can be for public interest, right? For administration of justice, for research purposes like census data, or for tax collection. So again, data being shared and processed for that does not require consent. or there's vital interest, right? So we saw how during the pandemic certain data needed to be shared, which was for the vital interest. So these are examples of how you can process data. Consent is just one of the many options available in terms of legal grounds. Similarly, different countries have different legal grounds available for processing. Children's data has come under the radar in the act, and rightfully so, because in many other countries they are adding this on under separate legislations or under other kinds of regulations. Okay, so we've because we've had the advantage of passing our privacy law much later, this has been incorporated in the law itself. So essentially, it says that, and children are defined as anybody who is below the age of 18, right? So, first of all, for any kind of processing, you need to get consent of the parent or guardian, and it needs to be verifiable. It's not so you need to ensure that you maintain evidentiary trail of this, right? You cannot do tracking or behavioral monitoring of children, or you cannot do targeted advertising to children. Very, very important, because today everybody does behavioral tracking and profiling, many times without realizing it. Many small businesses don't even realize they're doing it, but they have, for example, Facebook SDKs embedded in the app, or they have some cookies embedded. It is translating to doing that, right? And then there's a very umbrella sort of sentence in the law which says, besides the above, no processing that's likely to cause any kind of detrimental effect on the well being of a child. So, if your organization is dealing with children's data directly or indirectly, please remember you have to focus on it, and there's a whole bunch of can of worms that come out as a result of this. Okay. Um, Another very powerful thing that the law gives, and every privacy law accords some sort of rights to the individual. Okay, so one of the most powerful rights under the DPDPA is what is the right to information access about personal data. What does that mean? The individual, the organization needs to inform the individual whenever they invoke the right is what personal data is being processed about the individual, the principle that is, what is the kind of processing activities that are being undertaken with their data, list of identities of all organizations with whom the data is being shared, and a description of what data has been shared with whom. This, in my opinion, is one of the rights that essentially should give organizations sleepless nights if they already are not having it. Because just to be able to respond to this right is something which requires a huge amount of back end work to be done. Okay, building personal data inventories, etc., etc. So, and this is something which can actually impact an organization, whether you're right, large or small. Oftentimes, people say, on a different note, oftentimes people say, "Arey, why should somebody come and, the data protection board is going to have their hands full dealing with large organizations." Sure, maybe they are, but there are enough citizens and residents of India who are going to come and start asking and raising these rights. You will therefore have to willingly comply with the act. Okay. Then there is the other right to correction and erasure of data, which means somebody can come and ask you to correct and erase their data at will. Okay. Then there is the right to grievance redressal, and the fourth is the what is called right to nominate your data. That is something which is very unique to India. What do you do with your data after you uh, if you deploy a third party, basically a processor, to do any kind of processing on your behalf, make sure you have a valid contract, you document all the data that's being sent out, and you implement proper safeguards so that you remain accountable. Transferring data outside India has been made very laissez faire. It was very complex in earlier versions of the act. Now it is the government is just going to be giving a list of blacklisted countries, and everywhere else data can flow freely. Okay, we talked about the data protection board. There's also a set of duties that have been put into the act for individuals, right? So as individuals, we have certain duties, and they're listed out. And in fact, if you don't, follow duties, then there's also a penalty of 10,000 rupees. Okay, I'm not getting into the duties. And then, so what are the key penalties? And the reason why you need to take this act seriously. Again, like with every other law, privacy law around the world, so there's, if reasonable security safeguards are not installed to prevent a breach, there are fines up to 250 crores, right? Not giving notice of data breaches to the board and to affected data principals, about up to 200 crores. Not meeting obligations towards children, about up to 200 crores. Any other obligations which a SDF is expected to perform, missing that is up to 150 crores. Any other breach of the act is up to 50 crores. And as I said, there is a breach of duties on individuals as well, right? Okay. So again, if you come out of privacy and you're looking at putting this all together, right? Bottom line, what is the bottom line? Bottom line is that we are in an environment which is in a flux. It's continually evolving. The business environment is evolving. The tech and data environment is evolving. Geopolitics is evolving. The nature of attacks, frauds, crimes, etc. is evolving, right? Laws, regulations, mandates are also evolving. They're essentially trying to keep up with the reality. Interconnectedness is becoming more tighter and solidified, and people are, there's acute paucity of skills and knowledge at all levels, and there's a lot of misconception and skewed perceptions about what is what, right? Yet in this reality, organizations, businesses have to operate in a legal, fair, transparent, and ethical manner. Okay, so if you're in anywhere in this universe that you're working on, like you all are, you have a huge duty ahead. Okay, some learnings in terms of in helping organizations implement programs. Only, and I think this is like preaching to the choir. All of you know, only top down works. It has to be right at the top. You have to treat these as risk problems, not as technology problems. They translate into technology, but and at the crux of it is a risk problem. Deploy structured approaches, don't do ad hoc stuff, deploy stuff in phases. I like to use this term, don't try to use a Mercedes before you can learn to walk. Mature your program slowly and surely. Understand that these programs hit businesses at its core, right? For example, in privacy, you can't turn around and tell a business person, stop collecting 90% of the data you're collecting overnight, right? It's business at its core, it's hitting, it takes time for people to digest that, right? So actively engage in awareness and change management. Incentivize teams to do it. Some of the work that some teams do is so meticulous and gargantuan at the same time that you need to incentivize teams. And there is no silver bullet, which all of us working in security know that. Expect the journey to be slow and arduous. Okay. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. The talk was wonderful. There are so many questions that people have, and which people actually can reach out to you as well for answering. And I'm sure this session has given them so many insights and wonderful points to think about when it comes to privacy. And I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person soon, maybe at a new conference. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we're really, really glad to have you. Thank you.